Karoline Leavitt was not your average politician. Known for her sharp wit, bold decisions, and an unshakable determination, she had quickly risen through the ranks in Washington. People either admired her or found her too brash, but no one could deny that when Karoline spoke, people listened. On this particular day, she found herself aboard Air Force One, the iconic aircraft reserved for the President of the United States and their entourage. It wasn't every day someone like her got to ride on such a prestigious flight, and it came with strings attached. She was there at the personal invitation of the President himself. The flight was scheduled to take them from Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles, where a high-profile policy meeting awaited. The cabin buzzed softly with activity as aides flipped through documents, whispered into headsets, and typed furiously on laptops. Secret Service agents stood guard near the doors, their presence both reassuring and intimidating. For most passengers, flying on Air Force One was a surreal experience, but for Karoline it was just another opportunity to make waves. She sat comfortably in one of the plush leather chairs near the front, sipping coffee while reviewing notes for the upcoming discussion. At first glance, everything seemed routine. The hum of the engines blended seamlessly with the quiet chatter filling the cabin. But deep down, Karoline felt uneasy. Something about the proposal she'd been asked to review didn't sit right with her. As she flipped through the pages again, a nagging thought crept into her mind. There was a missing piece, a detail she couldn't quite put her finger on, but its absence gnawed at her relentlessly. She leaned back in her chair, staring out the window at the endless expanse of clouds below. Time was slipping away, and whatever issue she sensed wouldn't resolve itself if they landed in Los Angeles as planned. Without wasting another moment, Karoline made up her mind. Whatever doubts she had needed immediate attention, and she knew exactly where they could find answers: in Denver. It was risky, unconventional, and borderline impossible, but Karoline wasn't one to let protocol stand in her way. Rising from her seat, she straightened her blazer and walked purposefully toward the cockpit door. Two Secret Service agents stationed nearby exchanged quick glances, sensing something unusual was about to happen. After all, it wasn't often that someone requested access to the cockpit mid-flight. When the door finally opened after a brief verification process, Karoline stepped inside, her heels clicking against the metal floor. Inside, Captain James Reynolds sat at the controls, his hands steady on the yoke as he guided the massive aircraft through the sky. A seasoned veteran with decades of experience under his belt, Reynolds exuded calm authority. Beside him, the co-pilot glanced up briefly before returning his focus to the instruments. Neither man expected what came next. Standing tall despite the confined space, Karoline locked eyes with the pilot. "Captain," she began, her voice firm and unwavering, "I need you to change our destination." Her words hung in the air, like thunderclouds, heavy and unexpected. Captain Reynolds turned slightly in his seat, his expression unreadable but composed. "Ma'am," he replied evenly, "we are currently en route to Los Angeles per the President's schedule. Changing destinations isn't something we can do without proper authorization." Karoline didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her tone sharpening. "This is urgent," she said, her gaze never wavering. "We need to divert to Denver immediately. There's unfinished business there that cannot wait." For a split second, silence filled the cockpit. The co-pilot shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing nervously between Karoline and Captain Reynolds. Outside the cockpit, whispers began to ripple through the cabin as news of Karoline's request spread like wildfire. Passengers who moments ago were engrossed in work or casual conversation now strained their ears, trying to piece together what was happening. Who would dare ask such a thing? And why? The tension in the air grew thicker with each passing second, setting the stage for a showdown that none of them would soon forget. Captain Reynolds didn't react immediately. He turned his head slightly, studying Karoline with a measured gaze. His years of experience had taught him how to handle high-pressure situations, but this was something entirely different. A mid-flight request to change destinations? From a politician who wasn't even the president? It was unprecedented. Still, he kept his tone calm and respectful. "Congresswoman," he said slowly, "I understand your urgency, but altering our flight plan isn't as simple as turning a car around. There are protocols in place for a reason." Karoline crossed her arms, her jaw tightening just enough to show she wasn't backing down. "Protocols exist to serve people, Captain," she shot back. "They're not meant to tie our hands when lives might be at stake." Her voice carried an edge now, sharp and unyielding. She leaned closer, her eyes locked onto his. "What if I told you that delaying this decision could have serious consequences? Would that change your mind?" The co-pilot shifted uncomfortably, again, glancing at the instruments as if hoping they'd offer some kind of escape from the tension building in the small space. Captain Reynolds exhaled slowly, his fingers resting lightly on the controls. "Ma'am, with all due respect, my priority is ensuring the safety and security of everyone on board, and that includes following established procedures. Diverting to Denver without clearance would mean rerouting air traffic, coordinating with ground control, and potentially compromising security measures. These aren't risks we can take lightly." Karoline's frustration was palpable. She stepped back, slightly, running a hand through her hair as she thought quickly. "Look," she said, her tone softening just a fraction, "I'm not asking you to ignore every rule. I'm asking you to weigh the cost of delay against the potential benefits of action. If I'm wrong, then fine, we'll deal with it. But if I'm right..." She let the sentence trail off, leaving the implication hanging heavily in the air. Outside the cockpit, the murmurs among passengers had grown louder. The closed door did little to muffle the rising tide of curiosity and speculation. One aide whispered to another, "Do you think she knows something we don't?" Another shook their head, replying, "Maybe she's bluffing, or maybe she's onto something big." Whatever the truth was, no one could deny that Karoline Leavitt wasn't the type to make idle threats or waste time on trivial matters. Something had clearly rattled her enough to push this hard. Meanwhile, word of the standoff reached the president's chief of staff, who was seated further back in the cabin. A tall, stern-looking man with a reputation for being no-nonsense, he frowned deeply as someone relayed what was happening up front. Without hesitation, he rose from his seat and began walking briskly toward the cockpit. Passengers parted like waves as he moved, sensing the gravity of the situation. When he arrived at the door, he knocked sharply before stepping inside, his presence immediately commanding attention. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. All eyes turned to him. Karoline, Captain Reynolds, and the co-pilot, all frozen in place for a brief moment. Karoline recovered first, squaring her shoulders as she addressed him directly. "Sir, I've requested that we divert to Denver. There's critical information there that requires immediate follow-up." Unfortunately, Captain Reynolds has refused to comply. The chief of staff raised an eyebrow, looking between the two of them. "Refused?" he repeated, his tone laced with disbelief. Then, turning to the pilot, he asked pointedly, "Is that true, Captain?" Reynolds nodded once, his expression unwavering. "Yes, sir. As I explained to Congresswoman Leavitt, changing course without proper authorization poses significant logistical and security challenges. My duty is to prioritize the mission as planned, unless directed otherwise by appropriate channels." The chief of staff rubbed his temples, clearly weighing the implications. On one hand, Karoline's insistence suggested there might be merit to her claim. On the other, deviating from the schedule could create chaos. He glanced at Karoline, his gaze probing. "Do you have evidence to support this request?" he asked bluntly. "Something concrete that justifies such a drastic move?" Karoline hesitated for the briefest moment. Truthfully, her concerns were based more on gut instinct than hard facts, but admitting that wouldn't help her case. Instead, she chose her words carefully. "Not yet," she admitted, "but time is of the essence. Every minute we delay increases the risk of missing something crucial. We can't afford to wait until we land in Los Angeles." The chief of staff sighed heavily, shaking his head. "This isn't how things work, Congresswoman. You know that better than anyone. Even if we wanted to act on your hunch, bypassing protocol is a line we can't cross, not without jeopardizing the entire operation." For a long moment, Silence filled the cockpit. The hum of the engines seemed louder now, underscoring the weight of the decision looming over them. Karoline clenched her fists briefly before forcing herself to relax. She knew she wasn't going to win this battle. Not here, not now. But giving up wasn't an option either. With one last glance at Captain Reynolds, she turned and walked out of the cockpit, her heels clicking decisively against the floor. Back in the main cabin, all eyes followed her as she returned to her seat. Whispers erupted again, louder this time, as everyone tried to piece together what had just happened. Some admired her boldness, while others questioned whether she'd gone too far. Either way, one thing was certain. This flight was about to become the stuff of legend. Karoline sat back down in her seat, her jaw tight and her mind racing. The refusal still burned inside her, but she wasn't the type to let frustration show for long. She had learned early in her career that setbacks were just setups for comebacks. As the murmurs around her grew louder, she pulled out her phone and began typing furiously, her fingers moving with precision. Aides hovered nearby, unsure whether to offer advice or give her space. One of them leaned in cautiously and whispered, "Congresswoman, do you want us to draft a statement, or should we prepare for questions once we land?" Karoline glanced up briefly, her expression unreadable. "Not yet," she said firmly. "First, I need answers." She tapped out another message, then hit send before slipping the phone into her pocket. Whatever was happening in Denver, she intended to get to the bottom of it, even if it meant bending every rule in the book. Her determination radiated outward, silencing the whispers around her as people realized this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Meanwhile, Captain Reynolds remained in the cockpit, his hands steady on the controls. Despite the drama behind him, he exuded an air of calm professionalism. Flying Air Force One wasn't just about piloting skills. It required nerves of steel and an unshakable commitment to duty. Still, even he couldn't deny that what had just unfolded was extraordinary. He exchanged a glance with the co-pilot, who looked visibly relieved that the confrontation hadn't escalated further. "That was intense," the younger man muttered under his breath. Reynolds nodded slightly, his eyes fixed ahead. "It's part of the job," he replied evenly. "People like her don't take no for an answer easily. But at the end of the day, my responsibility is clear. Follow protocol and keep everyone safe." His voice carried a quiet authority, the kind earned through years of experience and countless high-pressure situations. Yet, there was something else beneath the surface, a flicker of respect. Karoline might have pushed too far, but her passion was undeniable. Few people would have dared to challenge a seasoned pilot on Air Force One, let alone with such conviction. Back in the cabin, the buzz continued to spread. Passengers whispered theories about why Karoline had made such a bold demand. Some speculated she'd received classified information mid-flight, perhaps a tip from an intelligence source or a breaking development tied to national security. Others wondered if it was personal, maybe linked to someone close to her who needed immediate attention in Denver. The possibilities seemed endless, and each new theory only fueled the growing intrigue. Even the Secret Service agents, usually stoic and unflappable, exchanged subtle glances, their curiosity barely masked. As the plane soared smoothly through the sky, the tension began to settle, but only slightly. People returned to their tasks, flipping through documents or scrolling through emails, but the atmosphere remained charged. Every so often someone would glance toward Karoline, wondering what she'd do next. Would she press the issue again, or had she accepted defeat and moved on? No one could say for sure, but one thing was certain. Karoline Leavitt wasn't the kind of person to let anything go quietly. Hours passed, and the aircraft finally began its descent into Los Angeles. The landing gear hummed softly as it extended, signaling the approach to LAX. Outside the windows, the sprawling cityscape came into view, bathed in the golden glow of late afternoon sunlight. Passengers gathered their belongings, preparing to disembark, but the energy on board was far from relaxed. Reporters and cameras waited on the tarmac below, eager to catch a glimpse of the passengers, and especially Karoline. Word of her mid-flight request had already leaked, thanks to encrypted messages sent by aides during the flight. By the time the plane touched down, social media was ablaze with speculation. When the door opened and the stairs were rolled into place, Karoline stepped off first, flanked by her team. Cameras flashed wildly as reporters shouted questions from behind barriers. "Congresswoman, did you really ask the pilot to change course?" one yelled. Another chimed in. "What's so urgent in Denver?" For a moment, Karoline paused, her expression calm but resolute. Then, turning to face the crowd, she raised a hand to silence the chaos. "I'll address your questions shortly," she said, her voice carrying over the din. "But let me be clear about one thing. When you see something that needs fixing, staying silent isn't an option. Sometimes doing the right thing means shaking things up, even if it makes others uncomfortable." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving the reporters scrambling to interpret her cryptic remarks. Inside the terminal, Captain Reynolds emerged from the plane last, his uniform crisp and his demeanor composed. He didn't stop to talk to the press, knowing better than to comment on operational matters. But as he passed by, a few colleagues approached him, offering nods of approval. "You handled that well," one said quietly. "Not everyone would have stood their ground like that." Reynolds gave a small smile, acknowledging the compliment without elaboration. He knew his decision would spark debate. Some would praise him for sticking to protocol, while others might criticize him for being inflexible. Either way, he had done his job, and in his line of work, that was all that mattered. As the passengers dispersed and the plane was prepped for its next journey, the story of Karoline's mid-flight demand began to ripple outward. It wasn't just gossip anymore. It was a defining moment that highlighted two very different approaches to leadership. On one side, there was Karoline, bold, relentless, and willing to push boundaries in pursuit of what she believed was right. On the other, Captain Reynolds, steadfast, disciplined, and unwavering in his commitment to rules and safety. Both had acted according to their principles, and both had left an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed the clash. For now, the world would have to wait to learn more. But one thing was certain. This was a story that wouldn't fade anytime soon. By the time Karoline stepped into the terminal, her mind was already racing ahead. The cameras and reporters were just a distraction, a sideshow compared to the real issue she needed to address. She knew the spotlight would follow her, but that wasn't what mattered right now. What mattered was figuring out why her instincts had screamed so loudly about Denver. Something, or someone, was pulling at the edges of her thoughts like a thread begging to be unraveled, and Karoline didn't believe in leaving threads loose. Her team hustled behind her, trying to keep up as she strode purposefully toward a private lounge reserved for high-profile passengers. Once inside, she shut the door firmly, cutting off the noise from outside. "All right," she said, turning to face her aides, her tone sharp and focused. "I need everything we have on Denver, right now. Any recent developments, any anomalies, anything that stands out. If there's something brewing, I want to know about it before we step foot in that meeting room." The aides exchanged quick glances, sensing the urgency in her voice. One of them pulled out a laptop and began typing furiously, while another grabbed a tablet and started scrolling through news feeds. Within minutes, snippets of information began pouring in. A sudden spike in law enforcement activity near Denver International Airport. Rumors of an unexplained delay in cargo shipments passing through the region. Reports of unusual weather patterns disrupting local infrastructure. None of it added up to anything concrete, but taken together, it painted a picture of something. Karoline leaned over the table, her eyes scanning the data as it appeared on the screens. Her gut told her these weren't coincidences. They were pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. "Get me someone on the ground," she ordered, pointing at one of her aides. "Anyone reliable who can give us eyes and ears in Denver, and find out if there's been any chatter, official or otherwise, that might explain what's going on." As her team scrambled to carry out her instructions, Karoline took a moment to think. This wasn't just about proving she'd been right, to push for a diversion. It was about understanding why her instincts had kicked into overdrive. Over the years, she'd learned to trust her intuition. It had saved her more times than she could count. But this felt different. Bigger. Like whatever was happening in Denver wasn't just a hiccup, it was a potential storm waiting to break. Back. On Air Force One, Captain Reynolds stood near the aircraft, watching as ground crew members performed their post-flight checks. Despite the chaos of the past few hours, he looked remarkably calm, almost serene. Colleagues approached him occasionally, offering words of encouragement or sharing their own thoughts about the incident. Some praised his decision to stand firm, calling it a textbook example of leadership under pressure. Others admitted they weren't sure how they would have handled such a situation themselves. One senior officer, a grizzled veteran with decades of experience, clapped him on the shoulder and said, "You did good, son. Not everyone has the guts to say no when the stakes are that high." Reynolds nodded, appreciating the sentiment but feeling no need to dwell on it. For him, the choice had been simple. Follow protocol no matter who was asking for an exception. That was the foundation of his job, not just flying planes, but ensuring the safety and integrity of every mission he undertook. Still, as he walked away from the plane and headed toward the debriefing area, Reynolds couldn't shake the memory of Karoline's determined face. There was something about her that stuck with him, not frustration or anger, but admiration. In another life, he might have considered her request more carefully. After all, people like her didn't rise to power without knowing how to read situations better than most. But his role demanded absolute adherence to rules, and he had honored that commitment fully. Whether history judged him kindly for it remained to be seen. Meanwhile, back in Los Angeles, the ripple effects of Karoline's demand continued to spread. Reporters stationed outside the airport filed updates to their editors, speculating wildly about what had transpired aboard Air Force One. Social media lit up with hashtags and memes, some mocking Karoline's boldness, others applauding her willingness to challenge authority. Political analysts weighed in on cable news shows, debating whether her actions represented courageous leadership or reckless impulsiveness. Inside the private lounge, Karoline scrolled through her phone, reading the reactions flooding in from across the country. She smirked at some of the comments, especially the ones labeling her as stubborn or dramatic. Those were insults she'd heard countless times before, and they rolled off her like water off a duck's back. What caught her attention, though, were the messages of support. Ordinary citizens praising her for standing up for what she believed in, even when it meant facing resistance. It reminded her why she'd entered politics in the first place. To fight for the things that mattered regardless of the cost. Her phone buzzed again, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was an encrypted message from one of her contacts, a trusted source with ties to law enforcement in Colorado. The text was brief, but loaded with implications. Unusual activity confirmed near DIA. Authorities tight-lipped. Recommend caution. Karoline's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The validation she'd been looking for. Whatever was happening in Denver wasn't paranoia or coincidence. It was real. She turned to her team, holding up the phone. "We're on to something," she said, her voice steady but electric with energy. "Denver isn't done with us yet. Start making calls. I want answers before sunrise." Her aides nodded, already moving to execute her orders. Outside the lounge, the world buzzed with speculation and debate, but inside, the gears of investigation were turning faster than ever. Karoline Leavitt wasn't the kind of person to let go of a lead, not when lives might depend on it. The private lounge buzzed with activity as Karoline's team worked tirelessly to piece together the puzzle. Phones rang, keyboards clicked, and hushed conversations filled the air. It was like a command center, a small makeshift war room where every second counted. Karoline stood at the center of it all, directing operations with the precision of a general on the battlefield. Her eyes darted between screens, her mind processing information faster than anyone else in the room could keep up. She wasn't just gathering data, she was connecting dots that others couldn't even see yet. One aide approached her cautiously, holding a tablet. "Congresswoman," he began, his voice tinged with hesitation. "We've got confirmation about the unusual activity near Denver International Airport. Local authorities have cordoned off an area close to one of the cargo terminals. Official statements are vague, just citing routine security measures. But unofficially, he paused, glancing down at the screen. Before continuing, unofficially there are whispers about hazardous materials being discovered during routine inspections. Karoline's brow furrowed as she processed the information. Hazardous materials? That could mean anything from industrial chemicals to something far more sinister. Whatever it wasn't supposed to be there, and now government agencies were scrambling to contain the situation quietly. The timing felt too coincidental. Why would this happen right when her instincts had screamed for her to divert the plane? She didn't believe in accidents or random chance, not when lives were potentially at stake. "Get me someone inside," she ordered sharply, pointing at another aide. "Anyone who can give us first-hand intel. If they're calling it routine, then they're hiding something. Find out what." Her tone left no room for argument. This wasn't just curiosity driving her anymore. It was conviction. Every fiber of her being told her that digging deeper was the right move, even if it meant stepping into dangerous territory. While her team scrambled to follow her instructions, Karoline stepped aside for a moment, pulling out her phone. She scrolled through recent messages, searching for a contact she hadn't reached out to in months. An old friend who worked in federal logistics. They weren't close anymore, but they shared a bond forged by years of mutual trust. If anyone could shed light on what was happening in Denver, it was him. She typed out a quick message. "Need your help. Something big is going down in Denver. Can you talk?" Minutes later, her phone buzzed with a reply. "I'm tied up right now, but I'll call you in 10. Karoline exhaled sharply, feeling a flicker of relief. This was progress. For now, she had to wait. But waiting didn't mean doing nothing. She returned to the group, listening intently as updates trickled in. One report mentioned heightened military presence near the airport perimeter. Another highlighted strange radio silence from certain communication channels typically active in the region. Each detail added weight to her growing suspicion that Denver wasn't just dealing with a minor issue, it was sitting on a powder keg. Meanwhile, Captain Reynolds sat in the debriefing room at LAX, answering questions from senior officials about the mid-flight incident. The atmosphere was formal but calm, with everyone focused on understanding exactly what had happened aboard Air Force One. Reynolds recounted the events clearly and concisely, leaving no detail out. His professionalism earned nods of approval from those around the table, but he could tell some still harbored doubts, not about his decision, that part seemed universally accepted, but about whether refusing Karoline's request had been the best course of action given the circumstances. One official leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Captain, you think Congresswoman Leavitt genuinely believed there was an emergency requiring immediate attention? Or was this simply a matter of political theater?" Reynolds hesitated for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Sir, I can't speak to her motives beyond what she said to me, but I will say this. She didn't strike me as someone making idle threats. Her urgency felt genuine. Whether she had solid evidence or not, I don't know. But I stand by my decision to prioritize protocol over speculation." The official nodded slowly, tapping a pen against the table. "Fair enough. Still, we'll need to monitor the situation closely. If there's any truth to her concerns, and if it impacts national security, we'll have to address it swiftly." As the meeting wrapped up, Reynolds felt a mix of pride and unease. He'd done his job, but the uncertainty lingered. What if Karoline had been right? What if delaying their arrival in Denver truly had consequences? These questions gnawed at him, though he pushed them aside for now. Speculation wouldn't change anything. All he could do was stay ready in case further action was needed. Outside the airport, the media frenzy showed no signs of dying down. Reporters camped out near the terminal, hoping to catch another glimpse of Karoline or anyone else involved in the drama. News vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical flowers soaking up sunlight. Social media remained ablaze with commentary, opinions divided sharply between those praising Karoline's boldness and those criticizing her for causing a scene. Memes mocked both sides of the debate, turning the incident into late-night fodder for comedians and talk show hosts alike. But amidst the noise, a quieter conversation was taking shape, one driven by people who understood the stakes better than most. Former military personnel, retired government officials, and seasoned analysts weighed in on forums and podcasts, dissecting every aspect of the story. Some pointed out how rare it was for anyone to challenge a pilot on Air Force One, let alone demand a mid-flight diversion. Others noted the complexity of rerouting such a high-profile flight, emphasizing the logistical nightmare it would create. Yet, despite the skepticism, many agreed on one thing. Karoline's persistence suggested she knew or strongly suspected something significant. By midnight, the pieces were starting to fall into place. Karoline received a call from her contact in federal logistics confirming her worst fears. Something highly sensitive had indeed been uncovered in Denver, and efforts were underway to manage the fallout without alarming the public. Details were scarce, but the implications were clear. Whatever was happening, it had the potential to escalate quickly if mishandled. Hanging up the phone, Karoline stared at the wall for a long moment, her mind racing. She had been right to push for answers, even if it meant clashing with authority. Now the real challenge lay ahead, figuring out how to act on what she knew without crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. As exhaustion crept in, she reminded herself why she fought so hard, for the people who relied on leaders to make tough decisions even when the path forward wasn't clear. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. By early morning, the weight of sleepless hours began to show on Karoline's face. Dark circles under her eyes hinted at the long night she'd spent piecing together fragments of information, but there was no trace of fatigue in her voice or actions. If anything, she seemed more focused than ever, like a runner hitting their stride after miles of pushing through exhaustion. Her team had pulled an all-nighter alongside her, fueled by coffee and adrenaline, and now they were finally starting to see the bigger picture. The updates coming in painted a clearer, if still troubling, image of what was happening in Denver. The hazardous materials discovered near the airport weren't just random industrial waste. They appeared to be linked to a shipment that had gone missing weeks earlier. Intelligence reports suggested it might have been part of a larger operation involving illegal trafficking of dangerous substances. Worse yet, there were whispers about connections to foreign entities, details intentionally kept vague to avoid panic. But one thing was certain: whatever this was, it wasn't isolated. It had tentacles reaching far beyond Colorado. Karoline paced back and forth across the lounge, her phone pressed to her ear as she spoke with her contact in federal logistics. "How deep does this go?" she asked, her voice low but urgent. "And why is nobody talking about it publicly?" On the other end of the line, her contact hesitated before responding. "Look, I'll tell you what I can, but you didn't hear it from me. This isn't just about Denver. It's about keeping the lid on something much bigger. There are layers here, and not everyone involved wants the truth getting out." Karoline stopped pacing, her grip tightening on the phone. "Layers meaning corruption or worse?" Her contact sighed heavily. "Both. And until we know exactly who's involved and how high up it goes, nobody's taking chances. That's why they're handling it quietly." When the call ended, Karoline lowered the phone slowly, her mind racing. She knew she was treading dangerous ground now. Exposing something this big wouldn't just ruffle feathers. It could bring down powerful people, maybe even entire systems. But staying silent wasn't an option either. For every minute wasted, the risk grew greater. Lives were at stake. And if history taught her anything, it was that silence often came at the highest cost. Meanwhile, Captain Reynolds had returned to his quarters, physically exhausted, but mentally restless. Despite the debriefings and reassurances from superiors, he couldn't shake the feeling that refusing Karoline's request might haunt him. He replayed the moment over and over in his head. The intensity in her eyes, the edge in her voice when she'd said lives depended on them being somewhere else. Was it possible she'd seen something he hadn't? Or was it simply a politician's instinct to push boundaries? His thoughts drifted to his family, a wife and 2 kids waiting for him back home. They were the reason he took his job so seriously, always putting safety first. But tonight, doubt crept in. What if protocol wasn't enough? What if sticking to the rules meant missing something critical? These questions gnawed at him, leaving him tossing and turning in bed. By sunrise, he made a decision. He would reach out to someone higher up, someone with access to classified information. If there was any truth to Karoline's claims, he needed to know. Back in Los Angeles, the media storm showed no signs of calming. Reporters continued to speculate wildly, spinning theories ranging from political power plays to national security threats. Social media buzzed with hashtags like Denver diversion and Air Force One drama, while late-night hosts turned the incident into comedic gold. One comedian joked, "Next time you're on a plane and want to change destinations, just say lives depend on it. Works every time." The audience erupted in laughter, unaware of how close the joke hit to reality. But behind the headlines and humor, real consequences were brewing. Word of Karoline's investigation leaked to rival politicians, sparking outrage among those who saw her actions as reckless. Critics accused her of grandstanding, claiming she cared more about headlines than actual solutions. Allies rushed to defend her, praising her determination and willingness to challenge authority when necessary. The debate divided Washington, turning what had started as a mid-flight disagreement into a full-blown political spectacle. Amidst the chaos, Karoline remained unfazed. She knew criticism came with the territory, especially when challenging entrenched systems. What mattered most was staying ahead of the story, not letting others control the narrative. As dawn broke, she called a meeting with her closest advisors. "We need to get in front of this," she told them firmly. "If we wait for someone else to break the news, we lose control. We release our findings first, and we make sure the public understands why this matters." Her team nodded, already working on a strategy to present the information responsibly. Timing was crucial. They couldn't act too soon without solid evidence, but delaying too long risked losing momentum. For now, they agreed to focus on gathering irrefutable proof while preparing a statement that framed the issue as a matter of public safety, rather than political posturing. As the day wore on, tensions escalated further. In Denver, authorities tightened security around the affected area, deploying additional personnel and restricting access to key locations. Residents noticed increased military presence and wondered aloud what was going on. Local news outlets reported rumors of evacuations and lockdowns, though officials denied any immediate threat to civilians. Still, unease spread like wildfire, fueled by unanswered questions and growing suspicion. Karoline watched footage of the scene unfold on TV, her jaw tightening. This wasn't just a local issue anymore. It was a ticking time bomb threatening to explode nationwide. Every delay, every attempt to cover things up only made the situation worse. She glanced at her team, seeing the same resolve reflected in their faces. They were ready to take the next step, whatever it took. "All right," she said, finally standing tall. "It's time to move. Let's do this right, but let's do it fast." With that, she grabbed her coat and headed for the door, her aides trailing closely behind. Outside, cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, but Karoline ignored them, focusing instead on the road ahead. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing for sure. This fight was far from over. As Karoline and her team stepped out of the private lounge, the California sun was high in the sky, casting sharp shadows across the bustling airport. Reporters shouted questions from behind barriers, their cameras flashing nonstop. But Karoline didn't break stride. She moved with purpose, her expression unreadable but her determination radiating like heat from a fire. Her aides hustled behind her, clutching folders and tablets filled with documents they'd spent hours compiling. This wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. It was about making sure the world understood why it mattered. The plan was simple, yet risky. Release a carefully crafted statement to the press that laid out what they knew without crossing into classified territory or tipping off those involved in covering it up. They had enough evidence to raise alarms: photos of restricted areas, leaked reports about hazardous materials, and first-hand accounts from credible sources, but not enough to bring down whoever was pulling the strings. For now, the goal was to shine a light on Denver and force authorities to address the situation publicly. If handled wrong, this could backfire spectacularly. But if done right, it might save lives. Karoline climbed into a waiting SUV, her team piling in after her. The vehicle sped off toward a nearby hotel where a press conference had been hastily arranged. As they drove, she reviewed the final draft of the statement one last time. It was concise, factual, and designed to provoke action without inciting panic. "This is our moment," she said aloud, more to herself than to anyone else. "We either get this right, or we bury the story forever." At the hotel, chaos reigned. Journalists packed the conference room, jockeying for the best seats while producers set up cameras and microphones. Word had spread quickly about Karoline's impending announcement. Fueled by cryptic teasers her team had dropped earlier that morning, speculation ran rampant. Was she going to apologize for causing a scene on Air Force One? Or was she about to drop a bombshell that would overshadow everything else? When Karoline finally walked in, flanked by her advisors, the room fell silent. All eyes were on her as she took her place at the podium. She adjusted the microphone, glanced briefly at her notes, and then looked directly into the camera. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady and commanding. "What I'm about to share with you today isn't speculation or hearsay. It's fact, and it demands immediate attention." For the next 10 minutes, Karoline laid out the details of what her team had uncovered. She spoke of suspicious activity near Denver International Airport, unexplained delays in cargo shipments, and the discovery of hazardous materials linked to illegal operations. She avoided naming names or jumping to conclusions, instead focusing on the potential risks to public safety. "This isn't about politics," she emphasized. "It's about protecting people. If we ignore these warning signs, we're gambling with lives, and I refuse to stand by while that happens." The room erupted as reporters fired questions at her, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of curiosity and skepticism. "Are you accusing someone of negligence?" one asked. "Do you have proof of foreign involvement?" demanded another. Karoline held up a hand to quiet them, her calm demeanor unshaken. "I'm not here to point fingers," she replied. "My job is to ask questions when something doesn't add up, and right now too many things don't. The answers will come later, but only if we start asking the right questions now." Captain Reynolds watched the press conference unfold. On TV from his quarters, his brow furrowed. He'd seen snippets of the investigation during debriefings, but hearing Karoline spell it out so clearly made him realize how close they'd come to ignoring a potentially catastrophic issue. His mind flashed back to the cockpit, to the intensity in her voice when she'd insisted they divert to Denver. Had he made the right call? Or had sticking to protocol cost valuable time? He picked up the phone and dialed a number he rarely used, a direct line to a senior official within the Department of Defense. When the call connected, he got straight to the point. "Sir, I need clarification on something. Was there any validity to Congresswoman Leavitt's request to divert to Denver? Because based on what I'm seeing now, it seems like she might have been onto something." There was a long pause on the other end before the official responded. "Captain, let me put it this way. Sometimes following the rules means trusting that others are doing their jobs. But yes, her instincts appear to have been correct. That's all I can say for now." Reynolds hung up, feeling a mix of relief and unease. Relief because he hadn't ignored a legitimate threat entirely. Unease because the system he trusted so deeply seemed to falter under pressure. For the first time in his career, he questioned whether blind adherence to protocol was always the answer. By evening, Karoline's press conference had gone viral. News outlets dissected every word she'd said, analyzing its implications and debating whether she'd overstepped her bounds. Social media lit up with reactions, ranging from praise for her bravery to accusations of fear-mongering. Politicians weighed in, some supporting her efforts, others condemning her for airing sensitive issues in public. The divide grew wider, turning the incident into a national conversation about transparency versus secrecy. But for Karoline, none of that noise mattered. What mattered was the ripple effect her actions had created. Within hours of her announcement, federal agencies issued statements acknowledging ongoing investigations in Denver. Local authorities lifted some restrictions around the airport, citing progress in resolving the situation. While no one admitted fault or provided specifics, the mere acknowledgement felt like a victory. That night, Karoline sat alone in her hotel room, staring out the window at the city lights below. The adrenaline that had carried her through the day was starting to fade, leaving behind a deep exhaustion, but there was also a sense of satisfaction, a quiet pride in knowing she'd pushed hard enough to make a difference. She pulled out her phone and typed a single message to her team. "We did good today." As she turned off the light and climbed into bed, she thought about the road ahead. This fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Powerful forces wouldn't take kindly to being exposed, and retaliation was inevitable. But Karoline had faced storms before, and she wasn't afraid of weathering another one. After all, standing up for what was right wasn't supposed to be easy. It was supposed to matter. And for her, that was enough.